economist in 2008 was the outcome of decades of financial deregulations and credit expansion, even its architects now more or less admit. Intertwined across the Atlantic, European banks and real estate operators were as deeply involved in the debacle as their American counterparts. In the EU, however, this general crisis was underdetermined by another peculiar factor: the distortions created by a single currency imposed on widely differing national economies, driving the most vulnerable of these to the edge of bankruptcy once the crisis struck. By the end of 2013, 5 years into the crisis, the GDP of the Eurozone had not yet recovered to the level of 2007. Nearly a quarter of its youth are unemployed. In Spain and Greece, not to mention Italy, the figures are catastrophic, 57% and 58% respectively. Even in Germany, piling up trade surpluses year after year, and widely considered the success story of the period, investment has been among the least in the G7 economies, and the proportion of low-wage workers, those earning less than a third of average income, the highest of any state in Western Europe. Such are the latest readings of monetary union. The quacks of austerity have bled the patient, not restored it to health. Now, after this presentation, which is on the negative side, who do we ask? We ask Constantin, perhaps, to elaborate. Now, each panelist will have no more than 10 minutes, otherwise we never end. Okay, thank you.
I think I'll try to do it shorter than 10 minutes. Setting aside the political philosophy, which I'm not a big expert in, much of what you said makes sense, and much of what you said is true. Very interestingly, we're right now at the pivotal point in European history in terms of simple numbers, because last month was the first month ever in European history where the intra-EU trade has outstripped the intra-EU trade. So as a result of that, the whole common market argument has just gone south. The idea that Europe is needed in order to facilitate trade amongst its members has just been outstripped by the fact that we are actually much more trading outside of Europe than we trade within Europe. The reason for it is very simple. In part it is related to the investment by Germany, and also in part relates to the fact that consumer in Europe is dead. Consumers are actually kind of fancy word the economists invented to really represent households. We as humans, do need things. We do need services. That's what we spend our incomes on, and we have less and less incomes. And in addition to it, of course, we have more and more liabilities. Before we had, in the previous generation, liabilities for ourselves and maybe our own old age and for younger children. Now we increasingly have liabilities for our 40-year-old children too, especially in the likes of Italy and the non-Mediterranean countries. In addition to it, we have a liability for Michael Noonan and for Renzi, for the rest of the governments, because they come in before our children come in, and they take money much more aggressively out of our pockets with a priority. We have liability to the banks. Before, the banks used to lend us so that we can save in the future, pay them down. Well, now we actually kind of just completely dump money into them in the hope that something will fly back at us sometime in the future. That's not a model for growth or anything. But fundamentally, let's look at this room. It just reminded me something. About in May this year, before the European elections, I was asked to address a new party in Italy. And I flew out to Milan, and there was a little bit of a meeting there, and myself and Professor Abushko from Stanford addressed that party gathering. That party gathering was about Europe. Of course, it was European elections. And the party members who were there, the average age was probably 20. The average age in this room, I would say right now, is about 50. Why is it? It's very simple. The young people in Ireland do not think of Europe as matter. That's the good news. They live lives outside of Europe. They work for multinationals. They hope to work for multinationals. Some of them work for the civil service. Some of them work for European firms.
But they do not see their future as being European. They see their future as being global at the very best, or maybe local at the very least. That in between, which is called European, is really reserved for a very small minority of those who will take the exam to work for Europe officially. In Milan, they actually care. Why? Because their own economy is not generating anything at all, and the only hope they have is for Europe to come in and rescue them in some way or another. That, of course, is not happening. So now, you have two models, effectively, or two options for Europe that we face not just now, and it's not just crisis which created and put it in front of us. Option one is in kind of, embrace the intergenerational change. Become, as a society, facilitator for a transition from one generation to another. The next generation always wants to live better than the previous generation. As the older people, we need to facilitate that for younger people and all. Schumpeterian destruction, creative destruction, has to work through. People need to have access to better jobs, new opportunities, ability to invest in themselves in terms of their education, invest into themselves as health and all, and at the same time, of course, have some sort of security means and all. Is that the model embraced by Europe? Not really. The model that Europe has embraced since its effectively foundation as the European Union, not the coal and steel community, but as European Union, has been the other one, the preservation of status quo of the elites, the intergenerational security, making sure that all the generations who have the power, political representation, and the assets as well in their possession, continue on to the jolly old retirement in terms of their own life retirement, yes? And the hell with the young. That's why there's 50% unemployment amongst the young. We're throwing them off the bus, so that our bus can travel lighter and faster towards that horizon. So what happens? I'll give you one example, which is an economic example, yes? And this actually illustrates to you exactly why this is not a new problem. You remember the European Monetary Union of the 1990s? Well, that bit the dust quite spectacularly, yes? It bit the dust for a simple reason. They created a currency, effectively, which was pegged. Yes, all the currencies had the names, but they were all pegged, so they were all acting like one currency. And the imbalances built up, and the complexity built up. So instead of actually addressing complexity that is built up when you create something uniform, a system which is challenged constantly from outside, they started to batten in the hatches even more and more until the whole thing imploded, yes? So the lesson which we should have learned is that we need flexible institutions, institutions which can be experimented on local level and see where the shocks get absorbed better and response is more accurate and all, and then adopt those experiences in. But no, what we responded to with is Euro. And what was Euro relative to EMU? That's more harmonization, more integration, more homogenization. So again, we then go into the Euro crisis, the current crisis we're in. And again, the response should be, let's learn the lesson, let's allow people, allow countries to experiment a little bit more, allow flexibility, maybe introduce parallel currencies, maybe start writing down debts and facilitate that write down in countries where they need it. Maybe do some investment facilitation so that Germany can invest more in other economies and the likes. No, 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 no. The response was, once again, more harmonization, more homogenization, more, again, integration. So we have that circle, the vicious circularity of European thinking, yes, which is there. We have a crisis, response to crisis, harmonization, integration, homogenization. As a result of that response itself, we generate more imbalances in the system because it is not flexible enough to even discover the right path or the solution. And then, again, complexity builds up in the system, it's challenged, and we have another crisis. And off we go, like a merry-go-round. And here we conclude with what, I'll conclude with what the ambassador addressed. Within that system, any sort of deviation, any sort of independent thinking is seen as a destructive force. So as a result of that, we are now obsessed with the secessionist movements springing on across the entire Europe. We're not concerned about the fact that Europe has lost any purpose for people, that they're actually willing to break themselves up. We are concerned with the fact that they want to break up. Not with the causes, not with the drivers, not with the identifiers. So Europe, to me, is much sicker than we actually, even in the wildest dreams, imagining it. It lost its purpose. And it never actually had that purpose beyond the very simple formula of trade, mobility of people, and mobility of capital. All of that can still be achieved and retained without having the European Union. All of that is just a matter of sort of agreements. That's it.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
start with the positive. I've been asked to speak about the good things about Europe, so I'll really mention two. The first, I think, is the intense cultural diversity within Europe in a relatively compact area, which has now been heightened by the freedom of mobility. The fact that somebody from Romania can come to live in Ireland, travel without restrictions, in my view, is a tremendous step forward. One of the features not so reported of the French Revolution, it was in fact in some of the cahiers of the French Revolution was a demand for passports. Passports at the time were a way of controlling people moving about one country, in this case France. We've moved to an era where there's far more regulation, control over people in terms of moving about. And therefore I think that that step in Europe of increasing mobility and therefore increasing cultural contact is a very positive thing. The second thing I want to just highlight as a positive thing is what I want to call the discourse of rights that ultimately go back to the European Enlightenment. The fact that people talk about the right to vote, the right to expression, that gay people now talk about the right to marriage, and I'll come in a minute, that people also have extended the concept to the idea of social rights, is a particularly European, I think, though not exclusive, issue. And where does it come from? It comes from, originally, that idea of the Enlightenment that God did not design society, people designed society, that a social contract had been formed between people of property at the time. That was the essential implication. That was where the original idea of inalienable rights comes from. But I think one of the features of the European labour movement has been to extend that concept into all sorts of areas. So people talk about a social right, a right to housing, right to a home. These are concepts that have been extended. Now, of course, this discourse was always contradictory. You know, even at its height, when people were talking about the inalienable rights of men, you have figures like Toussaint Louverture in Haiti, who says, well, I'm a man, happen to be a house slave, therefore got access to some of the French newspapers. I'm a man, why don't I have rights? Why am I a slave? And of course, the question of women's rights came much later. So it was a contradictory discourse, but nevertheless, it created, if you like, an anchor which people extended afterwards. Which is why our politicians always want to tell us these days, you don't just have rights, you have responsibilities. And the responsibilities are ever more burdensome, and don't you dare express your rights too much. So I think those are positive achievements in Europe. Now, the negatives. Well, I think there's a difference between Europe and the European Union. The European Union is a set of institutions. It is a particular institutional complex, which I agree completely with Perry Anderson's description, is run by an oligarchic caste and is increasingly distant from the population. And the critique, see, sometimes critically in Ireland people think, oh, if you criticise Europe, you must be on the right. I'm pretty much on the left, I think. I don't think Europe is particularly progressive. And that this idea of social Europe as an institution, not in terms of the minds of the people, in many ways was a mythology invented by people like Jacques Delors. When we look at the structure of the European Union as an institution, we find some extraordinary things. We have a European Central Bank, which is independent in the sense that it has no accountability to the population of Europe whatsoever. It's a European Central Bank that is worse than the Federal Reserve in America, because it doesn't have to take any account of levels of employment. All it has to look at is essentially price stability. And we find, for example, you look at who gets on the European Bank. I mean, we've been dominated this country by the moves of the European Central Bank. Who are these people? Well, let's take, for example, Jean-Claude Trichet. Jean-Claude Trichet was a governor of the Bank of France. He then served 4 years as one of the chairpersons of the trustees of the International Institute of Finance. You may not know who they are. They are the main lobby group for the bankers and finance houses of the world. So here we have somebody who's on the ECB, who was previously a lobbyist for finance, telling the people of Europe that we have to bail out banks. And if you call, this is not exactly what you call democracy. If you look at the European Parliament, it is a parliament that does not get to propose and dispose of laws like a normal parliament. It is a parliament that's wrapped up in continual committees. I'd advise any of you who haven't read it yet, have a look at a wonderful pamphlet by the Corporate Europe Observatory called Lobbygate. It's done as sort of a parody on the Lonely Planet, Lobby Planet. In Brussels, approximately 15,000 registered lobbyists in Brussels, dominating behind discussions, all sorts of issues, whether it's biotechnology or all sorts of obscure legislation. This is not a form of democracy. And therefore it's very important to say that against, if you like, the Europhilia, which often dominates, in my view, academia and indeed the wider society. And this really, this type of structure, a structure that's sealed off quite deliberately from popular pressure, was the ideal mechanism for transmitting neoliberal policies. Because Hayek, the founder of neoliberalism, always argued there's a distinction between democracy and liberty. And sometimes you must, if you like, restrict the ability of democratic masses to impose and encroach on individual liberty. And therefore the European Union, by, if you like, being sealed off effectively from popular pressure, was the ideal model to give local politicians the cover to bring in, for example, privatisation and deregulation. Think of an Irish politician. Why did you privatise, why are you beginning to deregulate the electricity industry? Why did you privatise the telecom industry? Why didn't you invest in Aer Lingus and keep it in state ownership? Because our hands are tied by the European Union directives. You know, the fact that they're part of those directives, but nevertheless it gives them this cover for doing it. So I think that the EU has been a very much a feature of that. The last point I want to make is, one would have thought, given all that's happened, that this whole structure of neoliberalism, of deregulated markets, privatisation, letting finance do what it wants, would come under question from the European Union. But in fact, quite the opposite. What we're moving to is a much more, what often some writers refer to as authoritarian or bureaucratic neoliberalism. We now live in a Europe where the budget has to be vetted by bureaucracy, the national budget has to be vetted by bureaucracy, where we have to have things called excessive deficit procedures. That means you're a bad person and you have to be watched continually for a number of years until you get your structural deficit, a concept, by the way, which economists have difficulty in defining, down to 0.5%. We have scorecards in Europe which look at all sorts of economic indicators, including, for example, labour costs. All of this is a tremendously bureaucratic framework. And you ask, where does all this come from? And it comes really from a particular brand of neoliberalism, often not so well known in this part of the world, the German brand of neoliberalism, ordoliberalism. The idea that in order to have a fundamentalist style free market, you have to have a strong state that creates a structure, as one writer put it, the moral policeman that sets up a framework which forces people to act in a very competitive way, and so on. Therefore, I believe we're moving to a Europe that's becoming more bureaucratic, more insanely authoritarian, and more neoliberal in response to crisis. And that indeed is a great irony.
Thank you very much. Before I ask Constantin to speak, by the way, when we all finish talking, the audience can interact with this gentleman, this lady. Okay? Well, we go to the last end of half an hour or so, dedicated to this. Right. So, Rosanna, say your opinion.
Well, obviously, I would say that I almost completely agree, especially with the first part of what Kieran said. I'm very pro-Europe, and I actually see all the benefits that Europe has done so far, starting from giving the possibility to all Europeans freely from one country to the other one, to set up their own companies, to work in a better environment, in a better country, and work towards getting a better environment, a better country. Definitely having Europe, having a European Union, having Europe as a whole country is definitely a benefit for European people. Said that, Europe the way Europe was structured is, as Kieran said, is very bureaucratic. What I think is that when it was set up, they didn't think about the possibility that one of the countries could actually have the possibility to step back, because they didn't have enough force and enough strength to actually leave behind the bureaucracy and the legislation that and the structure that is good for each European country and for the whole Europe. That's a big drawback that, and a big pillar that, according to me, Europe is missing. I see the benefit of being a whole country. I don't see European people thinking about Europe. Because each country still see their own country. They still talk about their own country. They still talk about their own population. They still talk about their own history. But they never study a European history. So what is missing is an education about Europe. Is an education about what Europe was, together with which country each country was, and an education about where Europe can and need to go. So, again, I say that Europe is, I can see that Europe can be considered Neale because of lots of reasons that have been already said, but there is a lot of benefits of being in Europe and working towards Europe.
Thank you very much. Now, Neale from the European movement says something.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellency. I haven't written a speech tonight because this is a roundtable discussion and a lot of really interesting points have been raised, and I wanted that to frame what I was going to say. See what the kind of feel of the room is, and it's quite different to a lot of the formats and a lot of the events that I go to. As Constantin says, I'm from the European movement. It says it right there in the name. We're in favour of the European movement. We're in favour of the idea of a wider Europe. I'm not going to come in and give you a Eurosceptic point of view, or necessarily give you probably the most balanced point of view, because I do fundamentally believe in the European Union, and so does my organisation. And some of the points that have been raised have been very accurate, and I've agreed with the points made by all four speakers so far, and I've disagreed equally with points, and I'll tease them out a bit. But where I'd like to start off my few remarks is to look back, take it a bit more simple. Unfortunately, I'm a simple enough guy, so that's an easy place to start. And I want to look at why did we have the European Union, and Constantin referred to it very briefly about where it all started, the European Coal and Steel Commission. And why was that created? Why did 6 nations, independent, sovereign nations, come together and say, let's pool our coal and steel resources under a supranational authority? Because they were in the wake of the most devastating conflict that has ever affected this planet. It cannot be understated. My generation, and I'm still in the 25 to 35 socio-economic category, we read about World War II in the history books. We see it in movie theatres. We don't appreciate the desperation and the destruction that occurred primarily on the continent of Europe through 6 very brief years, and previously before that in the Great War, the centenary of whose outbreak we're celebrating or remembering more appropriately this year. And that is where what has become the European Union since 1992-93 really started from. And I think it's very important when we look at discussing Europe, the future of Europe, the problems of Europe, that we don't forget that. It's too easy to forget that. But the whole idea behind the European process originally was to stop another great bloody conflict. And to the fore, to the main, that has happened. Europe and the countries within the format of the European Union have been relatively peaceful in that period since the early 50s when Schuman made his declaration. The same cannot be said by neighbouring regions such as the Western Balkans, or even today we think of Ukraine and Russia, and we think of Syria, and right on the borders of the EU. conflicts are breaking out. Yes, there's been small domestic conflicts in the European Union in that period, but nothing compared to that outbreak. And I've probably spent a little longer on that than I wanted to, but I think it's too easy to forget. It's too easy to dismiss and to go straight into the philosophical debates, the ideological debates, and the reactionary stuff that we see today in this ever-changing society that is 21st century Europe. But there's a number of the great achievements, what's good about Europe, because we're going to talk about what's good as well about what's bad, have already been mentioned. You know, there has been huge advance in social rights. We look at the, I suppose to give it a better name, the women's liberalisation movement of the 70s. Look to see how Ireland changed. And that's where I want to bring back to the effect European membership has had on this small little island, and particularly the 26 counties. A little story, when my late mother married my father, she was working for a bank. She got married, she had to quit her job. 2 years later, she was working for a different bank, supposedly a more progressive bank, an American bank. She had her first child. She had to quit her job again. That was only 30, 40 years ago. And we have to remember these are the big changes that have happened. Things that my generation, and a lot of people who, Kieran rightly mentioned, aren't in this room tonight, simply take for granted. But that's not to say Europe isn't without its faults. And they're quite obvious that Europe is with its faults. Because it is not this ideal thing. At the end of the day, in the 50s, when Schuman sat down to write his declaration, it wasn't a blank page. It wasn't like the founding fathers in America who could carve up and write a new declaration. He had to be reactive, looking at ancient civilizations that had dominated our continent back to the early empires, looking at the huge national differences in it, and the economic as well as cultural strengths that are obviously great things, but they created difficulties that have remained constantly through the evolution of the European institutions. And perhaps Europe has become too bureaucratic. Perhaps there's become too much focus on the minutiae of legislation and getting really deep into certain small policy issues, reacting too hastily, too slowly, and perhaps incorrectly at times. The best thing about life is you can say at times, I was wrong. I get that wrong. A lot of people need to be more confident to say mistakes have been made. Let's learn from them and make sure they don't happen again. Let's not wallow them and tear each other's faces off because mistakes were made, and look to see what can be achieved in the future. I suppose the biggest problem is that Europe remains a top-down initiative. It came from European leaders in the 50s wanting a new plan. It wasn't a bottom-up movement. And that's why we consistently see Europe and the concept of the Europe, and as it changed into the European, struggle to engage with the ordinary public, with the citizens. 1979 compared to 1978, when the European Parliament in 1978, no one was elected to it. There were parliamentarians from their own countries sent to Brussels for regular assemblies. The role of the European Parliament, the only directly democratic institution in the EU, has changed greatly in those few years. And it has to be acknowledged. Because if you're going to criticise, you have to acknowledge that some good things have happened. And in my opinion, the majority of things that have happened through this creation of the European Union have been positive. And they've been particularly positive for this small island. For as much of the troubles we've gone through in recent years, you have to remember where we were in the 60s when T.K. Whitaker and the mass started to look at, well, maybe Ireland should be part of this EEC and what's going on. No, we were still the island behind the island, where our exchange rate was set by the British Chancellor of Exchequer, and everything was relying solely on the UK. People say we give sovereignty away to the European Union, and I absolutely agree and acknowledge that, but we've gained so much sovereignty as a small country in return, but we can't dismiss that. If you look at the 28 member states that we have now, and try to put them on a global scale as individual countries, and very small countries like Ireland of 4 million, very large countries like Italy, the UK, Germany, would we be able to compete as a small island in the global economy, in the changing economy, when we've gone past thinking about the BRICS nations, the MINT nations? Where is Ireland going to have a voice? Where are we going to stick our head in the parapet? It's topical, so I'll mention it. Ireland's nominee for European Commission is going to have control over a significant amount of the EU budget. Ireland is going to have a say just a couple of years when we were completely the black sheep of Europe. So I suppose I've probably said a few slightly controversial things, some things my employer mightn't thank me for saying, but I've put them out there particularly because it's very, very easy to criticise. It's very, very easy to be negative. It's extremely difficult to be positive. And that's what I'll try to do today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Philosophical enlightenment?
I too, to echo your very nice presentation, I too am I mean, I grew up on the picture of Mitterrand and Kohl holding hands. That's what I grew up on. I grew up on this idea that, on this great idea that Europe was reconciliatory beyond the worst aspects of the nation states. Europe was built after the catastrophes of the 20th century, and who could have imagined that after those catastrophes, from the ashes of those catastrophes, a project of reconciliation would be born. And in this sense, what I grew up on, the idea I grew up on as a French citizen, was that the European idea was a political one. Yeah? It was a political idea. It was a political idea, and Europe, and the great thing about it is that Europe, which had invented and formulated the paradigm of nation states, and had lived through its most negative aspects, so wars, hegemonies, imperial ambitions, colonialism, was now adopting and giving itself a supranational political horizon. And this was a commonly willed, wished, chosen, and this was a moment of great enthusiasm. But what I regret, and here begins my negative aspect, is that this political dimension was of the project quickly fell to the second plan, very quickly. Why? Because it risked to compromise the aspiration that it had promoted. The European construction supposed that we would elaborate entirely this idea in a concrete plan of governance and institutions, and furthermore, that we precisely marked what was to be the rapport, the relationship between the supranational idea and the nation states which composed it, and in particular, that we entirely redefined the idea of sovereignty. We were speaking about sovereignty. But this didn't happen. This didn't happen. To begin such a fundamental rethinking and reformulation of the very ideas of political governance in a continent which had just been ravaged, risked to kill the baby at the moment of its inception, so to speak. So the politicians placed in first line and on the first plane, as first priority thus, something other than the political. And this was, of course, the economical union. The economical union, the common market, with the goal of achieving the token bond that is the unique currency, the euro. We were thinking, or perhaps as we are realizing today, not thinking the European idea. That is, we marked this idea firstly as the construction of shared economies, circulation of goods and people. The political question, the foundational question of who and what we are as Europeans was to come later, was to be solved later. The problem, as my colleagues from Trinity College, Constantin, and my colleague from UCB, Professor Kieran, just elaborated, was that the transition from the economical to the political did not happen. Did not happen as we perhaps thought it would. The first reason for this failure was that the process of construction of Europe was realized without it being accompanied by declared and manifest interest from the European peoples for this construction. We weren't even asked. We weren't even asked. The people was not asked. Indeed, we cannot even say that there was a proper, limpid, clear information and consultation of these peoples on the effects, the ends, the means of what was taking place. European institutions were thus conceived and put into place without the participation of the peoples. Hence, it's not surprising today that these very peoples lived the European idea as a foreign reality which only manifests itself to them as an administrative bureaucratic will without democratic legitimacy. And to aggravate this first reason, well, the successive deregulations of the economy and of finance, which began in the 70s, in particular with my compatriot, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, which opened the door wide open to the expansion without limits of neoliberalism. The result is clear. The political lost ground and was forgotten. Neoliberalism deployed itself globally, and globalization was finally the result of an extension without borders of a financial movement which obeys its own economical law and which has very little time for particular political worries, such as the definition of an identity, the comprehension of a culture, the invention of a history. Because that's, according to me, philosophically speaking, that's what Europeans lack, the invention of our history. We must invent, rethink, invent, reinvent our history. The situation was immensely sped up by the fall of the Soviet Union, and in this situation, end of the 80s, well, economy and the financial system took power, a power of which we must say, as we see it today, is anti-political. The paradox is that from opposing this movement, the European nation states in fact engaged it even more radically, contributed to it, and lent their hand to the constitution of a power which is fundamentally hostile. I believe this is a fundamental wrong in Europe. The belief in the capacity of the auto-regulation of a liberated market, liberated firstly and foremostly from any political or juridical reglementation. The consequences are evident in Europe today, and Concetto has displayed them for us in his introduction. A few more things. On the level of the national states, I would like to say there's a, and everybody knows this, a growing lack of interest, if not already an irrecuperable disinterest of the political. The last political elections in France, I speak of France, it was amazing the amount of people that didn't even want to vote. And the result was who was voted in DFN, the Front National. Growth in most of the European countries of the extreme anti-European right, like in France. And of course, as I said in my brief little presentation, Europe today is perceived as an administrative machine entirely disconnected from the peoples, and in this sense is seen by most as hostile, limiting, and restrictive power. And on the European level, and I think this is a great blame that we must mark, is that there is no cultural identity for Europeans. We still hold on to the idea that culture must, can, and only be national. We haven't thought of a European cultural identity. And furthermore, as a consequence, the incapacity to formulate a real concrete idea of European political governance beyond the bureaucratic, beyond the administrative schema. All this, and I was very sensitive to what Constantin said in his opening remarks, about crisis aggravating crisis, about the crisis and the answers that we can provide to crisis are the aggravation of the crisis. This has a very strong name in the history of philosophy. It's called nihilism. Nihilism is the moment where everything that can be engaged to counter a crisis aggravates this crisis. Are we in Europe in a moment of nihilism because of the fallout of, or the incapacity for Europeans and the European Union to elaborate a cultural European identity?
Well, thank you.
The panelists here have said enough for a lot of skirmishes between all of us, all of you. Do we do that, or do we ask the audience to interact with you with questions? Okay, both. Okay. First question. Very good.
First of all, congratulations for organizing this meeting this evening, and congratulations to all the speakers, because all of them, with great passion, they put forward a point of view which which one can accept or one can not accept. Well, you said Europe is ill. That needs a doctor. Let us call it. We are in 2014. Today, we are in the position of reflecting, of saying negative things about Europe, because we want to establish what the last speaker was saying, this European cultural identity. I think that up to yesterday, we weren't fully aware of the process towards which Europe was going. Now, we have our own responsibility in bringing remedies to the illness of Europe, to the lack of purposes in the vision of Europe, and also we need in many ways to try to build not only this European cultural identity, but just to try to reflect on our identities, personal or but still national identities, the richness of them, and bring what's of best there is in them for the future of Europe.
Okay, answer. Thank you very much. Now, who wants to reply?
I'll take some of it. As an economist, what can I say about cultural identity? As a human being, what can I say about cultural identity? Culture is something that we do when no one is watching. You can't bloody build the thing, okay? You can't invent it. You can't concoct it out of thin air, issue a directive by the DG culture in Brussels, and drop it onto all of us. It's an organic evolutionary process by which we identify ourselves with something that the priors started building. We build on it and we add to it. We no longer build anything, we preserve stuff. Every building in town has a preservation order on it. We don't build anything new, very little of it, okay? So you can't build an identity, you have to allow it to evolve. Where did European cultural identity come from? All this diversity, which is brilliant completely, is it European Union which created it? Or is it centuries of Europeans fighting each other, town on town, and then competing against each other? Who makes a better prosciutto? Who makes a better café? Who makes a better wine? It's the latter. It's the competition between the smaller entities where people had the identity in the first place, bestowed to them by past generations. And forget mobility of people. You ever heard of Renaissance? That wasn't mobility of people. The European Union, as far as I understand, didn't invent the bloody thing, didn't promote the bloody thing. Yes, we have mobility of people, but so we did in the 19th century, and so we did before that as well. Now, not all of the parts of Europe. The war, yes, the war is a part of our identity as well, beyond any doubt. I am Russian, hey, ethnically, yes. The war is a huge part for Russians of our identity, okay? But do we have to think today, in the 21st century, that the only thing standing between the French and Germans from going at each other's throat once again over the Alsace and Lorraine is the European Union? Jose Manuel Barroso is the only thing which keeps peace in Europe. Have we sunk so low as human beings that we have to go at each other's throats still? I don't think so. So when we talk about the European Union, cultural identity, and all of that, we're talking about the invented sub-reality. We live in everyday reality, which is, again, we inherited from the past, which is in part, yes, of course, influenced by the fact that we have the mobility of people around. We have mobility of capital around, we have trade, free trade around as well. The same stands for the rights as well. There are plenty of countries out there in the rest of the world, wake up and smell the roses, which have the rights. They didn't inherit them from Brussels. We keep talking about things as if they are categorically impossible. Without Europe, there will be no peace. Exit from Europe isn't possible. Actually, it is possible. Greenland exited Europe, yes, quite successfully, by the way. There wasn't a war, and it used to be a part of the European Union. It no longer is, yes? Why do we have to categorize everything? The reason why we do is because we have an extremist view that there is only one good, and everything else, therefore, is by definition bad. It's black and white view. Europe we identify as the force for good, or the force for bad for that matter if you're a Eurosceptic. But in reality, it's neither. It's just an institution, just like the Austro-Hungarian Empire had institutions, which are gone bye-bye, no one remembers them. The idea of the organic evolution of the identity and political institutions, that I think is pivotally important. But that's different from inventing identity. I hope I
Thank you very much.
addressed that somewhat.
Thank you very much. That was an excellent point, obviously. But you see, I think that the paradigm shift of this idea of the European Union, which is now part of our history. And I agree with you. You can throw it out like we've thrown out the Austro-Hungarian Empire institutions, or you can always throw out institutions. I mean, the process of history is such that we know since Hegel, at least, that the process of history goes through negations. Yeah, and we negate the past, and we. But the idea, the political idea of Europe, as you know, and if we're going to take seriously that idea, and I believe that. I understand what you said. It's very easy. We can come out of Europe. You cited the example of Greenland and Switzerland, and the center of Europe is not in Europe, and it's doing great. Yeah? It's doing great. And they don't want to be part of Europe, like the plague for them. But what I wanted to say is that if we are to take this paradigm shift very seriously, and I believe we ought to do, then the onus is to shift our idea of culture, is no longer to think of culture as something of an inherited set of values or habits, but to actually reinvent beyond national cultures, reinvent another idea of culture. That's a challenge for Europe, because that's a challenge for philosophical Europe, to risk the possibility that there is more than one definition of culture, that there is more than one definition of identity, and that thinking can go beyond the simply passive cultural thinking, can go beyond the simple reception of inherited values, which is the way, I agree with you, we've always thought about culture. I'm a French guy, I have a croissant with my coffee in the morning. When you're a German guy, you have or girl, you have saucisse, or you have postcards. But the European idea of culture would have to transcend this and invent another, faithful to the multiplicity of cultural identities that could be our identity. Now, in relation to what you were saying, talk of identity is always very, very dangerous, and I think that's what's animating a little bit of what Constantin is saying. It's very dangerous. The historical examples that we have of thinking of identity and formulating an identity for an entity or a political entity are usually, and we have the experience in the 20th century, disastrous. So I really believe that this is a paradigm shift that must force us to rethink entirely the idea of culture, of identity, and of sovereignty. It's not just going back to our national identities and hoping that from them will flourish an idea, all of a sudden we're all brothers and sisters under the sun of Europe. We have to put in the effort of thinking of that which we can strive towards, which will enable a transcending of our national anchoring into the possibility of a supranational anchoring.
Thank you. Another question, please.
Observation, I guess. I think that culture is really fundamentally about shared values. And the shared value that seems to be at the center of Europe, as the gentleman was saying earlier, is a defensive one, a defense mechanism. We want peace and security is the fundamental value that we all share within this geographic region. And peace and security mechanism are at the essence of what Europe is. Won't Europe be defined in a test of that? And I personally worry whether we are ready or willing or have any appetite for defending our borders, such as in Ukraine, or following on some of the very alarming remarks coming out of the UK earlier this week about whether incursions in Ukraine spelled problems for the borders in the Balkans and the Baltics, that sort of thing. So I just wonder if you think that just applying Darwinian philosophy, if we really are destined to test Europe in an external conflict, and whether we have the appetite, resources, or willpower to do that.
Thank you.
Well, actually, I don't really see. First of all, I want to make a distinction between Europe and the European Union, and I don't regard myself as European to share a defence arrangement with the British Prime Minister or for that matter the French Prime Minister, so I want to dispute that. First of all, I just want to agree with Constantin. The idea that France and Germany don't go to war because of Manuel Barroso is absolutely absurd. The reason why France and Germany don't go to war is that the era when they controlled empires and were involved in a race for empire is over. They move to different forms of economic domination, and therefore it's not the European Union, the particular institution, that stops them going to war. However, where there is a grain of truth to it is that Europe is increasingly developing a defence policy, but it's a defence policy based on propping up the arms industry and increasingly intervening outside the borders of Europe with a collective imperial ambition. Okay? Now, I just maybe want to spell that out. Mostly Constantine may come in on the issue of Ukraine. We don't always agree. I'm not sure we would agree on this one. But I mean, to say that it's poor little Europe who's going to be run over by hordes coming from for example, Ukraine, I dispute that completely. You've had, for example, in Ukraine, historic divisions going right back over hundreds of years, and you've had both empires, in my view, empires, in other words, countries with ambitions to begin to dominate spheres of influence, in one case Russia, but also the EU. The EU is involved in a project in the Ukraine to detach that country from what they would see as the Russian Empire. And therefore to see it as poor little Europe about to be overrun, I don't agree with that whatsoever. And broadly speaking, when we look at